Hey everybody, welcome back to Meta Perspective. And today we have a really awesome guest. His name is Evan McMullen. So welcome, Evan.
Thanks for having me. Been enjoying talking to you, and I'm excited to see where today goes.
Definitely, man. And I really appreciate you coming on. And I found you on the Stoa, which is a really cool YouTube channel. And it's you were having this fascinating talk with Frank Yang, Daniel Ingram, and Michael Taft on awakening and meditation, psychedelics, everything kind of involved with consciousness, really. So I found that fascinating, and I was trying to find you, and after I couldn't find you, and then I eventually somebody tagged you in a Twitter thing, which was really cool. So it was a cool synchronicity. Um,
Nice.
so awesome to have you on. And you have a really cool handle. What is it? Gnomic Perfect?
Yeah. So I used to in high school, like sort of my life was structured around two things. One was band and playing the French horn, and the other one was competitions and classics and like Roman and Greek, cultural studies, history, and language. And so I was a huge nerd for Latin and Greek grammar. And so in the study of Latin and Greek grammar, a gnomic perfect is a use of the perfect tense to express a general or timeless truth. And so I'm the sort of weird creature that has a favorite use of the perfect tense in Latin, and gnomic perfect is my favorite. And so that's been my handle online since, like the year 2000 or so.
Yeah. So that's really awesome, man. Um, now, obviously, when I saw you on the Stoa, you're talking about all these really deep issues about meditation and awakening. Where does that journey begin for you?
Well, it depends on where you want to talk about beginnings. It's always tricky to, unweave a tapestry into where it begins and ends. So one way of answering that question is to say that, my dad, got into Zen style meditation in college. And my mom has been practicing Iyengar yoga for, well, just about 50 years at this point. So you could say I grew up with it, like on the bookshelf at home when I was really little, I read things like Be Here Now and Alan Watts' The Book, and the books by Suzuki Roshi on Zen and so on. I kind of fucked around with that a little bit. I tried practicing meditation a bit. I remember I was at this like nerdy summer camp and seventh grade at Duke University. And, I called myself a Buddhist. I had a little statue of a Buddha. And like, then a guy from India, this kid from India had heard there was a Buddhist on the floor and he wanted to talk to me. And I just felt so ashamed because I didn't know shit. This guy was like asking me real questions and I was like, and so I kind of
Yeah.
like got a little traumatized by that, honestly, and sort of set all that aside. But then I got into, again through my mom, I got into the works of Tom Brown Jr., who's this guy who, like many teachers, there's some amount of controversy surrounding, but I generally like his stuff. He teaches wilderness survival and like earth skills. He's worked with, among others, like U.S. Special Forces to teach them living off the land and survival. And he was trained under, according to him, an Apache elder. And so his books, he has these wilderness survival guides, but one of them is called The Guide to Living with the Earth. And it talks about like feeling the concentric circles of living things passing energy to each other, having awareness as like a Native American scout would. And so I spent a lot of time as a teenager just kind of in the woods and nature, like practicing the skills that that was teaching me. And I'd call that the real start of what I now think of as my practice. And then, and fast forward a few years in college, I basically dropped out of college at 19 because I had just discovered Vipassana meditation and psychedelics within the same 1 month period. And this was November of 2004. So that's when things sort of the turbocharger turned on, and that became my life. So I dropped out of school and fairly quickly after that dropped out of the job that I had and sort of focused on that stuff full time for quite a while.
Yeah. And what kind of Vipassana was it? Was it like a Goenka school?
Yeah, so my first, I did several retreats in the Goenka thing because, so, funny story, the way I actually discovered this was I used to have this hobby, where I would, I'm a sophomore in college. I'm sitting there in this like house in the sort of student area of town, and I get kind of bored. So like I just sit there and take bong rips and hit random page on Wikipedia. And I happen to be taking Sanskrit in college because again, I'm a language nerd, like I mentioned with the
Yeah.
Gnomic Perfect thing. And I wasn't taking it because I was into sacred texts at the time. I was taking it because it's kind of like Latin and Greek, but more so. Like Latin has, like a certain number of like separate like cases for nouns and moods for verbs that are distinguished grammatically, and Sanskrit's got like twice as many. It's just like super linguistically complicated. I found that fascinating, so I was taking it as a language nerd. But we'd been reading some of the Bhagavad Gita, the Ramayana, and so on, so we're getting into being able to read some Sanskrit. And I ran random page on Wikipedia, and the page that popped up this particular night was a page called Vipassana. And I'm like, oh, I know what that means. It's like an intensive of to see. It's like seeing things really truly, or seeing through things, or something like that. And I read the article and I'm like, oh yeah, cool. So this is a meditation form. Oh wow, they still do this. Oh wow, there's this like dude named Goenka that offers retreats for free. And I'm a poor college student. So like free room and board for 10 days sounds like it's going to save me some cash anyway. And they've got one like 2 hours from my house. So I might as well hop a ride and see what it's all about. And I did. And, from my perspective, the rest is history.
What was that first retreat like for you?
Well, it's funny. A thing about me that you may have picked up from like seeing me on the show or whatever. My mom and sister were kind of taking bets as to whether or not I would be like literally capable of maintaining the vow of silence for 11 days. My mom bet I wouldn't. For the record, I did. But it was cool. It was really intense, and so I discovered psychedelics through some friends. Just a couple weeks beforehand, right? And so I'd had that experience. Literally little synchronicities abound. Like driving down to a party at the college that my sister would later attend. I finished reading this book, Gödel Escher Bach, in the car, right? And one of my friends came down from MIT for this party, had just finished reading it also. And so, the college that we were at, New College in Florida, has, like this, the central dorms are architected by I.M. Pei, the same person that did the Vietnam War Memorial. And so I'm in this sort of Escher like architecture, lying up, having my first psychedelic experience, having just finished Gödel Escher Bach, thinking about strange loops of consciousness and talking to this
Yeah.
gorgeous girl who goes to MIT who just finished the same book. Like, there was something quite synchronistic about that. And so this was very fresh in my mind as I went into my first Vipassana experience. And I was basically thinking, wow, there's a whole nother layer to perception and mind than I had thought, than I had known about. I'd read books, but it all sounded like hippie bullshit to me, frankly, until very recently. And so I was just really determined to, engage in the practice and see what it was all about. And so I got some very interesting results. I was hitting what I now look back and recognize as some pretty intense jhanic states by like day 7 or 8. Had some really intense experiences of, sort of what you might think of as formless realms in that sense, like not really having a body, not really having a differentiated perspective, but nonetheless being aware and conscious in quite an intense way. And they do these things, the Dipthana, the settings of strong determination, starting on day 5, where you take a strong determination not to move at all, like not to even adjust your tongue or anything, right? For the whole hour. And that powered things up quite intensely for me. I don't know if it works for everybody, but that's really when we started doing those settings of strong determination that the consciousness really started to shift in really profound ways. And so I got a lot out of it. And, one way I described it to a friend when I got back is I was raving about how everybody needed to go do this. I was like, oh my God,
Yeah.
all you guys, you need to go this. It's free. Like, come on, man. This is so cool. And one way I described it is I felt like I could see more colors, right? Because I've been so in my head. I'd been so relating to things through a sort of like linguistic faculty that I wasn't paying attention to just the raw sense data coming in. And so I felt like I could actually see richer, more saturated, more differentiated colors as a result. And that lasted for months, and And I was pretty serious after that. Goenka says you should practice at least 2 hours a day at home. So I, sure enough, bought a Zafu, a Zabuton, started doing 2 hours a day. I bought the CDs of the chants and the recordings from the workshop, so I could listen to those at home and just really hit that hard for a couple of years after that.
Yeah. And speaking of, you said you found psychedelics around the same time. Um, and actually, when you were on the Stoa, you guys talked about that. What do you kind of think generally about? And I don't mean to frame it in this way, in a negative way, but overall, like psychedelics versus meditation, or do you see them as complementary? Or
I'm almost like a uniquely bad person to ask about this. And I'm saying that kind of tongue in cheek. But so for me, I try to be honest in my communication. And so I look back, and definitely some incredibly profound shifts and changes and total reconfigurations happened in what I think of as myself, my consciousness, the way I relate to those things over a certain period of time. But I cannot responsibly tell, like I cannot honestly tell, to what degree were those changes caused by meditation? To what degree were those changes caused by psychedelic practice? And to what degree were those changes caused by an irreducible combination, a synergistic effect of meditation plus psychedelics? Honestly, man, I don't know. And so, it's also an extraordinarily dangerous path to mix those to the intensity that I did. I had a lot of friends that did some similar things. And according to me, very few of us came out of that not sort of profoundly damaged. And so there's a high risk factor involved with those particular combinations, at least given our current social context where most psychedelics are illegal. There's very little in the way of a wisdom tradition that's intact and available. I mean, you can find people underground, but if you're just some dude in a small city in the South, like I was, then like, where do you go to find those people? Well, they're hiding for good reason. And so, like when I look back on it, I think that my guess is that it was a combination of the two that was really crucial for me. But I can't honestly know for sure.
yeah, what you said for good reason they're hiding. Why do you say that?
Well, so a couple weeks ago, I had the honor of meeting a guy named William Leonard Pickard, right? So he's a guy that you may have heard of when they arrested him in the, I think, late 90s at a old missile silo in Kansas. The DEA claimed that the world's supply of LSD was reduced by like 90 to 95% pretty much overnight. He wrote a novel called The Rose of Paracelsus, which is only a novel if you have a particular kind of sense of humor. It's an autobiography, and people will call it magical realist, but that's because they're coming from the frame of conventional society. It's basically true as far as I can tell. And so he's this wonderful human being who works for the planet, for consciousness, for life, as far as I can, has for almost his entire life. And, he was sentenced to consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole and was compassionately released during COVID, but it took an act of Congress to do this, right? So you ask why these people are underground. Well, that's what happens when you're insufficiently underground in these sort of circles, and given the current regime of power in this world. So that's what I mean by good reasons.
Yeah. But circling back to the meditation, I know you're familiar with like the progress of insight. Do you feel that, between the psychedelics and even the Vipassana meditation, that you were cycling through what we call like the progress of insight?
Absolutely. Yeah. Like when I encountered those maps, which was sort of after the fact here, the Vipassana people aren't that big on the Theravada map theory. They like to tell a lot of stories from the Pali Canon, from the Dhammapada. They like to tell some of the Jataka tales, Buddha's past lives kind of stuff. As far as the map theory, you don't get much of that. At least, I mean, I did several retreats. I served a couple courses. I did a Satipatthana Sutta course. So, like it's not like I was totally at the surface level of that, but they do get into it a little bit. And then some of the texts they recommend that you read, but for them, it's more about shut up and practice, right? I definitely, when I encountered the stages of insight models later on, could look back on some experiences and say, yep, okay, this maps pretty well to my own experiences. So, but again, I can't tell how much of that came from cycling through those stages because of intensive meditation practice versus how much of it came from cycling through those stages because of intense and conscious practice with psychedelics, because those were both happening at the same time, but definitely the maps there are, according to me, pretty decent ones for the most part. I have some quibbles with them, like I have quibbles with fucking everything, but you know, yeah, it seems basically to be the sort of thing that goes on there, and like say people like Daniel Ingram talk about. I think one crucially important thing is, at least in the modern world, ton of people who are naturally sensitive for whatever reason will at least hit an A&P like kind of by the time they're teenagers, have some crazy thing happen to them. Like I think he talks about it in the context of his dreaming practice as a kid. And like, I had some similar stuff happen as a kid before I got into any of this, where like I would do like, the little floaties, like the little phosphenes you can see like in bright light. And then, right.
Yeah.
I would basically do a concentration practice on those. Like when I was on long car rides, I'd let my vision glance into the sun, and like we'd be driving up to see my grandma in North Carolina, and I'd just like see how long I could hold that thing in my mind and let it grow and shift and morph, So
yeah, that's actually like a fire casino, really.
It's basically fire casino, except I never closed my eyes, with all eyes open. But that just seemed like the thing to do. And I had some crazy ass experiences where I'm sitting back there, my little sister's in the back seat next to me, my parents are up there listening to an audiobook or the NPR or something like that. And I'm like having what I now recognize as a psychedelic experience, and I'm like 7, right? And that's just like, okay, I guess that happens to people. So, the stages of insight thing, I'm not sure how much it has to be consciously cultivated versus the way it's just a description of the sort of cyclical or spiral nature of the way that mind unfolds. So, there's that.
Yeah, absolutely. And you, after that, you continued to do, did you continue with the meditation after that?
Yeah, so I became pretty eclectic for a while. Like I basically, so I remember a conversation I had. I don't want to call anybody out. I'm not going to mention any names or which particular Vipassana center this was at, but one of the assistant teachers, I call them, right, was a nurse for their day job, and it was a thing that you could like ask for ibuprofen or aspirin for a headache when you were on these retreats. I basically went to one of the times you could ask Q&A. I'm like, so let's talk about the fourth precept or whatever, right? Let's talk about the precept against intoxication. Why is it okay for somebody to dull out their pain with aspirin and not okay for me to do something which is the opposite of intoxicating with psychedelics? I could never receive a satisfactory answer to this sort of question from the Vipassana people. And, they also, like I said, honesty's always been important to me. And I've never been perfect at living up to that standard that I set for myself, but I try. And so when you sign up for these Vipassana things, they want you to say that, like, you're only doing this practice, the Vipassana practice, as they teach it. They don't want you to mix it with other spiritual techniques and technologies. And I had started picking up Kung Fu, like Shaolin Kung Fu, from a teacher who is pretty prominent in the Southeast, and very skilled. And so as part of this, I was learning Qigong. And that's a form of energy work, meditation practice that, according to the Vipassana people, is incompatible. And I wasn't going to lie and say I wasn't doing both. So I didn't feel like I could, in good conscience, continue to volunteer at their retreats and go as a student there when their paperwork says very specifically that that's not allowed after a certain point. So I stopped being affiliated with them in any formal context. And Tallahassee has a little Buddhist center, the Tallahassee Buddhist community. So I played around there with some Zen and Chan stuff. They have some decent teachers there, and they had a lot of Tibetans come through. So the religion department at Florida State is actually really excellent for what you'd think of for a state school in the South. And they had a professor there who was a deep expert in Vajrayana, like academic study of Vajrayana. And so due to his influence, I believe, lots of Tibetan lamas and yogis and acharyas and rinpoches would come through and offer teachings and empowerments and transmissions at this little tiny Tallahassee Buddhist community. So that was my real introduction to Vajrayana. And then I also got involved with a guy who turned me on to a whole new world. Like one person who I can say has been a hugely important influence in my path, who was a guy I met working at a bookstore, actually. I just got a job for something to do that was like a cover story, if you will, minimum wage, working at a bookstore. And this guy worked there too. And, he had a very interesting life. And he was fairly high-level practitioner of a Japanese martial art with roots in Mikyo, the Japanese forms of Vajrayana, Shingon Buddhism. And he turned me on to that world, to the world of tantric martial arts. He turned me on to Tai Chi and the tradition of Montauk Chia, his whole Qigong lineage. I started getting into that. I discovered that one of my best friend's moms had been into that for like 20 years. And so she started working with me a little bit there.
Yeah.
He turned me on to Crowley, to Timothy Leary's later work, like, after the psychedelic stuff per se, his info psychology and so on. He turned me on to Robert Anton Wilson. I'd read Illuminatus because my dad had it lying around, but the sort of Cosmic Trigger, Prometheus Rising, quantum psychology, Robert Anton Wilson type stuff. He turned me on to Gurdjieff and the Fourth Way. He turned me on to a bunch of resources in psychedelic shamanism that I wasn't aware of, and made some connections for me to certain people that proved really useful. And so I just, man, did I learn a ton from this guy, and I'm super grateful to him. And so, that really shifted me in such a way that I realized that there was a version of Buddhism that was compatible with the way that I viewed the world and the importance I placed in psychedelic experience. And this version was basically called Vajrayana. And so I should start looking into that. And
Yeah.
so that was around 2005 or six or so that all happened. And so since then, I basically have been practicing something that I do think is Vajrayana. I mean, and I've gotten some empowerments and transmissions and teachings from various, legit high-ranking Tibetan lamas and Rinpoches. But, I've always sort of done my own thing. Nobody really likes to talk about psychedelic use too openly, especially through such a language barrier. So I've sort of combined the transmissions I've gotten in that sense with the transmissions that I honestly believe I've received from the sort of plant spirits, if you want to put it that way. Things like ayahuasca, things like DMT, things like 5-methoxy DMT, that realm of things, which I really view as gurus in their own right, and powerful world teachers. So since then, my practice has basically been a synthesis of the sort of view of tantric Buddhism, along with some very unusual teachers that don't exactly have human bodies.
Yeah. And this is going to come off as like, I guess, an oversimplified question, right? But why do you think, in your perspective, the psychedelics have been so important in your journey?
Well, so for me, like, I wrote this thing so I did this experiment where I did 5-MeO-DMT every day for 3 months at pretty high doses, like 15 to 20 milligrams. And
Yeah.
this was profound and interesting. And, we can get into that later, but I wrote this thing right after that, which I've still got lying around somewhere on G Drive. I'll send it to you. It's kind of embarrassing. You'll see 21-year-old me is writing, but at any rate, the thing I was talking about in there is that there's a sort of like view that I associated with the Eastern traditions, right? Taoism, Buddhism, the Dharmic faiths writ large, that's very holistic and very like, synergetic and very how do you say this in words? It's like focusing on the non-duality rather than the duality. It's focusing on the integration of parts rather than the reduction into parts, right?
Yeah.
And then you have the West, and our intellectual tradition and spiritual traditions are very much sort of have a reductionist bent. We want to split God into the Trinity, and then we want to split that into saints. And then, we've got science, and we want to split the world into, molecules and then atoms and then quarks, and, drill down to the root of things. And this gives us wonderful access to, like third person mathematical views of the world and the ability to create these powerful technologies. But, well, I mean, look at the state of the world right now, man. Look at the environment. Look at, look at the psychic environment. We've got a whole nation, a whole, half of the globe that just has to choke down pharmaceutical psychotropics in order to feel okay every day. And this has some problems. But then the Eastern side also has some problems because, well, in the dynamics of material history writ large across, human civilization, well, they kind of lost in important ways to the Western thing because of the way that it enables technology. And so I was really looking at psychedelics as being a point from which a sort of dialectical synthesis could occur between these two seemingly opposite worldviews, right? Because it's a thing that you can create and measure using Western scientific technology. DMT, 5-MeO-DMT, LSD, they have very specific molecular characteristics. They can be synthesized in a lab, they can be measured, they correlate with brain activity in very specific ways. And yet, they pretty consistently induce the sort of non-dual or mythopoeic or, like these sorts of states that are spoken of in the religious traditions of the world, especially in the East, the sort of non-dual, holistic, transperspectival states that are, the bread and butter of things like Taoism. And so, I felt like it was a really powerful sort of point of contact between these two seemingly opposite worldviews. It was the one thing they both almost had to admit was real, based on the way they each were choosing to slice the world in terms of their ontologies. And so I don't know if that answers the question, but that's basically why I found psychedelics to be so important in this sense, is because, it felt like a real bridge, because I grew up as a, like rigorous, rational, skeptical thinker, like my dad, dropped religion, somewhere around age 12, despite growing up as the son of a pastor, and, was really into, like I grew up being read out loud, Richard Feynman and so on, and like thinking about rhetoric and logic and how to think real good, and the sort of tools of scientific skepticism and epistemology. So I wasn't going to let anything into my worldview that wasn't real according to those tools. So for me, psychedelics were the thing that was obviously a part of the real world, described by physics, and yet it's a portal to something entirely other than
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. That's an excellent way of describing it. You mentioned that you did an experiment with 5-MeO, 3 months. That sounds insane to me. What was that like?
Well, I mean, it was insane. There's a quote from Nietzsche that I think really describes what it felt like to me, with a caveat that I'll deliver after. So Nietzsche says, "He who hunts monsters must be careful not to turn himself into a monster. And when you stare long into the abyss, beware the abyss also stares into you." To be perfectly honest, the way I relate to that experience is that it feels like I stared into the abyss for so long that now the only thing that stares out of my eyes is the abyss. But abyss has negative connotations for most people. So I like to think of it as being more of a pregnant void or a luminous space rather than an abyss. But something shifted fundamentally during those 3 months that hasn't shifted back. That's the best way I know how to describe it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's pretty incredible. Now we've talked about the progress of insight. How would you relate, and or actually, speaking of stream entry, do you think it's possible for somebody to reach stream entry through like processes that you used?
It would shock me if it's not, but again, I can't speak from personal experience that psychedelics alone are enough. And we know that meditation alone can be enough for a lot of people, right? Based on the history of Buddhism. So maybe the psychedelics were just a distraction. My intuition says no, that's not the case, that they were a crucial part of my own process, but being very clear about what I can and cannot say for sure, I don't know, man, because I was definitely doing really high dose
Yeah.
meditation for years. So before, during, and after this particular experiment. So, again, where the causal linkage is, I don't know, man. But my intuition says you probably could. But my intuition also says that a lot of my friends that did a lot of other high dose psychedelic play and experimentation did not have such positive results, or at least not such consistently from their own perspective positive results. And I kind of think this is because the tools that I gained through meditation gave me the ability to sort of surf the waves of these
Yeah.
intense states of consciousness in such a way as to, find a grounding in groundlessness rather than scrambling for a grounding in a solid ground. That's sort of kind of the point of a lot of this Buddhist stuff. And I don't know how well I would have been able to handle any of that stuff if I hadn't been developing concentration and insight and metta practices at the same time, and really intensely. I think I probably would have gotten a lot more lost than I did, and I got pretty lost for a while, just for the record. So
Yeah.
people's mileage may vary a lot, but that was my experience.
Yeah, and just a disclaimer for people, we're not promoting any of this. We're just talking about Evan's experiences here. We're not we're not
Yeah.
endorsing any of this.
And I mean, to be quite clear, as I've gotten older and reflected more on these experiences, it's been a pretty consistent thing that I recommend that other people do this less. Like, I used to be like, everybody should do this. And now I'm like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Like, actually, that was the voice of foolish youth speaking. And I'm quite sure that everybody should not do this at this point.
Yeah,
And this is obviously a highly personalized thing that people can relate to or not. But, obviously, there's the legal issues, there's the issues of effects on one's social web, and how people in one's life may react to this sort of thing. And it's a really high risk thing, like it in Buddhism, we talk about, the distinction between sutra and tantra, right? As far as Buddhist paths are concerned. And one common thing you hear is that tantra is quicker, but far more dangerous. In that sense, I think that psychedelics have something of a tantric nature here. Could be
yeah,
quicker, definitely a lot more dangerous, a lot worse failure modes than just standard meditative practices, which definitely
yeah,
have their own failure modes. And there's a lot of stuff coming out from places like Cheetah House and so on about how, well, even just normal like MBSR type mindfulness can leave some people in some pretty dark places. Well, this is all that cranked up way past 11.
yeah, yeah. And you're still practicing meditation and everything, like continuously, like today and
It depends on what you define as meditation, to be perfectly honest. Do I have a regular sitting practice each day where I like sit on a zafu and meditate? Like, honestly, no. But in my own sort of phenomenal experience, the distinction between the types of consciousness that I was embodying on the cushion, the types of consciousness I was embodying off the cushion, sort of those merged quite a while ago. So when I get really busy with like work or family life or things like that, I'll make a point of carving out like a week or 5 days or something like that and doing like a silent solo retreat. And I really cherish those moments. And I do like, I do a lot of things that I consider meditation. So, for example, for me, I love cooking, and cooking is a
yeah,
place where I can get into a just flow with the universe, where things are just occurring. They just arise and they pass away, and that's very meditative for me. And I do I do a good bit of something that you might squint at and say is yoga nidra.
oh yeah, wow, yeah,
So as far as a formal sitting practice, so like my partner, my wife, does this, and I'll sometimes do sits with her. She'll sometimes join me for these retreats. But I don't, you know, I don't really draw a distinction between life and practice at this point. To the
yeah,
extent that I'm living, it's all practice. And so there doesn't seem to be as much of a calling to take, an hour or two out of the day and sit in complete silence, because the way I relate to the world is that the world is in some, from certain perspectives, pretty dire straits. The stuff that on the Stoa we refer to as the meta crisis. Um, and so my practice is being as useful as I can to the other beings in this world and to life itself. And so if that counts, then I'm practicing all the time. If that doesn't count, then man, I fell off the horse a long time ago. So decide for yourself there.
yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, that's kind of like very mindfulness esque in a way. Um, but the yoga nidra thing, I'm interested in that.
Yeah, I mean, so the Yoga Sutras are pretty clear about what they're all about, and it's not about asana. Um, you
Yeah,
know, uh,
yeah,
the beginning of the Yoga Sutra, roughly rendered, could be something like yoga is the process or the practice of stilling the ripples that pattern the surface of the deep, clear waters of eternal mind, right? And so
yeah,
Yoga Nidra is sort of a extended shavasana corpse pose type practice, usually done in the dark, where one can explore some very interesting places of the mind. No self, non-duality, more mystical, sort of like otherworldly, subtle realms, astral realms, some Bogakaya type experiences all become quite available with the Yoga Nidra practice. And I've been lucky enough to work with a couple of great teachers in this particular discipline. And so for me, I find that particular physical posture to be extremely high value for cultivating the sort of, because for me, when I do something that feels like a formal practice now, it's usually from the frame of I would like to sort of balance, restore, and recuperate some level of energetics. And so for me, Yoga Nidra is a sort of like, royal road to that. And that's usually what I'm doing if I'm going to set aside some time and space for like I do seated practice and standing practice mainly when I'm like on retreat. But when I'm doing just like I've got an hour in the day and I could really use a clarity and recharge thing, then a sort of Shavasana style, Yoga Nidra for an hour or two thing is basically my practice at this point.
Yeah. And when you're talking about Yoga Nidra, do you use like the Yoga Nidra body scan?
Yeah, sometimes, or I'll sometimes, I mean, there's a lot of richness in the various Yoga Nidra traditions. There's stuff you can do that's basically connected with sort of like Indic astrology practice, where you're relating to specific stars, which I like to play around with, the sort of celestial energies in that sense. There's a thing that I'll do that's sort of like what Daniel talks about with his fire casino stuff, except the sort of thing being the thing providing the initial boost to the sort of like visualization of the sort of energetics is more like relating to a particular chakra or sort of flow between particular chakras as a sort of object of awareness. And then that unfolds in particularly interesting ways and creates a sense of a space that one can explore and inhabit for a while. And so, I don't really at this point intend much. I kind of think intentionality is a spook. So I just sort of see what arises and let that happen.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, so we're gotten in a lot of directions here, but why not? What's kind of your experience personally with like UFOs?
Oh, so that's a big one. So like I mentioned before, one of my main people you could call a spiritual friend or you could call a teacher, pick whatever label you want. This guy I met working at a bookstore turned me on to, among other people, Robert Anton Wilson. And Robert Anton Wilson, was this interesting guy, friends with all the psychedelicists of the 60s and 70s out in California, involved with Timothy Leary and John Lilly and so on, and a wonderful experimenter and writer on his own right. And he went through a whole series of events that he refers to as chapel perilous, where reality tunnels, as he calls them, sort of break down, become destabilized. You're more easily hopping between reality tunnels, and one of the things that tends to happen there is a certain quality of experience that you might call a sort of close encounter. And like we were talking about earlier, he he mentions the fact that some people have hypotheses around the ET phenomena, that it's actually, well, it could be not just like extraterrestrial within our universe, but a sort of interdimensional type hypothesis where there is a certain commonality of thematic narrative to things like people's experiences with the fairies in Ireland, or people's experiences with the Alfar, the elves, in Iceland and Norway and the Norse times. Even the Greek myths of people sort of going to the underworld and then time getting wonky and they come back and they're still young and everybody else is old and things like that, right? Well, like, man, that Rumpelstiltskin even, like, okay, this stuff like
Yeah.
really kind of correlates with a lot of the stuff you'll hear from people that have had really close contact experiences with the sort of UFO phenomena. And so for me, I've had enough experiences of like shit in the sky that is not behaving according to the way it should, according to my like fairly decent understanding of the standard model of physics, and also is sort of having pretty profound and interesting effects on the consciousnesses of observers of this phenomenon. And well, then there's the whole thing where the phenomenology of DMT is basically like the phenomenology, and this is NN-DMT, not 5-MeO-DMT to be clear, is basically the phenomenology of like an incredibly intense alien abduction experience, except usually with a slightly more positive emotional valence. Like Terence McKenna's self-transforming machine elves may just be ultra-terrestrials from another dimension piloting some craft. I mean, pick your model here. There's something common to these experiences that people also sometimes happen upon in meditation when they start exploring what in Tantric and Mahayana Buddhism is sometimes referred to as the Sambhogakaya, the world of bodhisattvas and dakinis and gods, that man, there's something there. And language, human linear language, is almost uniquely poorly suited for describing this sort of thing. So anything I say about this is going to piss someone off, right? But like I will for now say, like, yeah, according to me, that stuff is, there's something real going on there, and real is doing a lot of work in that sentence, because, well, is reality real? You get strange loopy here pretty fast, but there's definitely
Yeah.
something going on in the cluster that's being pointed at by like contact experiences and unexplained phenomena and that stuff. And so we can take this conversation wherever you want to with that, but I'll definitely go on record as saying, yep, I've had those experiences, and according to me, there's something quite real going on there.
Yeah, for sure. Um, and have you ever had like maybe like an interaction like with thought, kind of like you saw like an object and there was some kind of interaction quality to it?
Yeah, definitely. A few different times. Both in states that were facilitated by plant and fungal medicines, as well as in states which were stone cold sober, according to Western science. So I've had both of those. And yeah, like I've had some really interesting experiences that correlate strongly with the in particular Amanita muscaria, which is a non serotoninogenic entheogenic substance, the sort of Alice in Wonderland toadstool mushrooms, basically, right? And this pretty consistently correlates for me with experiences that involve time getting strange and contact with objects in the sky happening. I've also had some really interesting experiences, around the area of the country that they describe as Area 51, and also had some really
Uh,
weird experiences that I'm not sure if they were really this kind of weird or where they were just some crazy testing going on, near Eglin Air Force Base and Pensacola. Like, I was watching some F-22s do some pretty crazy shit in the sky, and then I was watching something that was definitely not an F-22 doing some even crazier shit in the sky, which came with some conscious content as well. So, yeah, there's plenty of others I could mention, but that's definitely
yeah.
the sort of thing that I've experienced.
Well, the Pensacola area, there was a whole like UFO flap over there.
Yeah, this was at around like '04, '05, sometime around that time period that I had that experience there. So I don't know if this, like, I actually had heard that there was a UFO flap in the Pensacola area, but if this sort of correlates with that time period, well, it makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, it was. I believe it was a little earlier than that, but again, I actually live in the Hudson Valley area, and I was born during the time the Hudson Valley UFO flap was going on, and I knew a lot of people in my area who had experienced it, witnessed it, and some who had interaction qualities to the encounters. And I mean, there's a lot of activity over here still, I think. Some people speculate, oh, maybe it has something to do with the nuclear plant over here or what, but who knows?
I mean,
There
speaking
could
of
be
the
a
Hudson Valley, I definitely had some of these experiences when I was working up at the Omega Institute in Rhinebeck. Definitely saw some very
Oh,
strange things while I was
wow.
there, but that place is an energetic vortex. And so,
Yeah,
who
yeah,
knows whether it was in my head or out there, or what the distinction between those two things in my head and out there actually is. But yeah, there's definitely still some interesting energy in the Hudson Valley, that's for sure.
yeah. Well, and again, if the Hudson Valley UFO wave in particular, there were like, and again, you could still put a question mark and say, is this some kind of mass subjective thing, right? But I mean, there were kind of like mass sightings, like there were like hundreds of cars parked over. They pulled off the Taconic State Parkway to watch this giant boomerang, you know, go over, and again, fascinating stuff. Um, but let's shift gears here a little, because this is meta perspective. I do some UFO stuff here, but not uniquely like my other channel. Um, and let's look at the question of awakening in general, right? I'm interested in kind of your perspective on like what awakening is, right? We kind of have like a um presupposition to assume what it means. So how do you look at awakening?
Oh God, there's a lot of perspectives that seem useful here. I guess I would say that, well, so one way I like to look at this is that there's a certain kind of game that consciousness likes to play with itself. And part of the nature of the game is that you kind of have to forget that you're playing it. It's like the way that, say, when you're playing a role-playing game like D&D or something like that, right? That it's really just a lot more fun and a lot more engaging if you can allow a little bit of what the Nordic LARP people call bleed to happen, right? Where the sort of phenomenological experience of the player and of the character sort of have some bleed through, and it sort of feels like you actually are that character, right? Well, I kind of think that there's something similar going on with consciousness at large and the generation of phenomenal reality in general, such that we basically are all sort of playing games with ourselves slash consciousness at large. And part of the game is that we kind of end up pretending that we're not playing such a game. And awakening seems to be a process by which people can still participate in this game, but also somehow not quite be fooling themselves about the nature of the game so much. So that's maybe one lens into it. You know, there's another lens into it that I sort of gesture at in the Stoa series that I did called The Bridge, which has to do with the idea that, we, from a more Western scientific perspective, pretty clearly never interact directly with reality as it's described by physics, right? For example, we interact with a virtuality, a virtual reality, which is generated computationally in our brain. And so awakening from this frame would be something like realizing fully and at a gut level and embodying the realization that what I just said is in fact the case, that the world we inhabit is a phenomenological world that's generated by, well, the brain or our consciousness. And that, this is not at all identical to the world, the reality, the physical universe out there. And so there's all kinds of strangeness that happens because of the fact that we're basically in a matrix generated by our own brains. And so, we go through life, many, if not most of us, acting as though we interact directly with the real world. And according to Western science, this just basically can't be the case. We can't be interacting directly with the world. We're interacting with some sort of representational thing generated by our mind that we experience as a virtuality, right? But I mean, there's no solid objects in the real world, right? There's the real world is mainly empty space and things all sort of vibrating. And even to call them things is a bit weird because like the distinctions between matter and energy and, all this stuff starts to break down when you get deep into the quantum levels. And I'm not trying to advocate some sort of particular flavor of quantum woo here. I'm actually a bit allergic to a lot of that stuff, but just the raw truth of that is that whatever it is that we're interacting with, it has persistent ontological qualities like solid matter being different from empty space, being different from energy, which like just don't map onto the way that physical law says that things work, So awakening doesn't to me necessarily mean you perceive the universe directly, so much as that you perceive quite clearly that you're not perceiving the universe directly.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's almost like I guess you can say like like the matrix or simulation hypothesis. And what do you think about the idea of like enlightenment then?
Well, on the one
Kind of like,
hand, I think that it's kind of a thing, but I also think that it's really hard to describe in language. So my sort of way of relating to this is that is there basically a series of operations within one's consciousness or perspectival shifts that can be caused that will sort of reframe the situation such that you are seeing more clearly what the sort of world you're in is and how it relates to the experience of being consciousness, to awareness itself, and that there's a sort of like state change there. I mean, that definitely seems to be the case, right? However, when you look at now we get into the weeds where you look at particular models, like say a Theravada four path model or like a Tibetan Burmese model, or like the models they have in Advaita or other traditions, right? And like where they draw the finish line doesn't seem to be the end, according to me. Like that seems to be, in a certain sense, only a beginning. And some of the traditions do talk about this and do get into this, but really the thing that people refer to as awakening or arhatship and say a Theravada four path model seems to be just like I don't know, man, the kind of thing that in a healthier society would sort of happen as a matter of course with people by the time they were, I don't know, in their mid 20s. And like people are going to keep growing after that. They're going to keep learning after that. And so I think that, is it a huge accomplishment in our current society? Sure, it's got to be. But also, like, in a healthier society, probably wouldn't be viewed as such a big deal, would probably be viewed as like the sort of thing that you did right around when you like could legally drink.
Yeah, yeah, no, I know what you mean. Um, now, you're we talked before about you're into like um AI and all that stuff. So how do you perceive that in a lens of like even a awakening, or and how do you see that as an interaction or for our growing understanding?
So I'm not really let me think of how to put this. Depending on how you frame it, I'm either into AI or very much not into AI. So I currently basically agree with the analysis of my friend Forrest Landry, who says that he thinks he's basically got a proof that friendly AI is more or less logically impossible when implemented on silicon, right? I kind of do take up that sort of perspective. I think that the attempt to create silicon-based artificial intelligence is not necessarily impossible, but is a terribly unwise idea, at least certainly for the current, 100-year time period or something like that. Like, I've been involved, at least peripherally, with the sort of like existential risk, friendly AI alignment communities. I've followed the work of the major players in those spaces for over a decade, and they're right to be concerned about it. I think they're kind of barking up the wrong tree, thinking they can make AI that's implemented on silicon friendly to humanity or carbon-based life in general, for reasons which we could discuss if we want to. But I do really enjoy the work of people like Yosha Bach, who I have unfortunately at this point never met, but who I think of as a sort of kindred spirit nonetheless. He has very similar models to the ones I have regarding, what he and I both like to call virtualism, this sort of frame that I presented on the Stoa that I just mentioned to you about the phenomenal world, the phenomenological world being a sort of virtuality generated in the brain, right? And so he, as an AI scientist, is, according to him, primarily interested in AI in order to understand the human mind better. He's basically asking, so we have the space of all possible computations. Well, what sort of computation is the thing that we experience from the inside as ourselves, as our mind, right? And so, to the extent that I'm interested in AI as an active topic of my own research, it's in that manner. I'm interested in looking at the sort of space of like, so we've got information theory, we've got algorithms, we've got computation, we've got Turing completeness, we've got people discuss the possibility of sort of like a more powerful computation than just Turing machines, and that's some debate about whether that's a thing, right? But these sorts of frames and metaphors seem really useful for discovering exactly what sort of process that we are. And certainly for me, like navigating the realms of intensive, like many day long with many hours a day meditation retreats or psychedelic states, having a set of computational and information theoretic metaphors to call upon to help navigate those spaces was deeply useful to me and continues to be deeply useful to me. So I don't know if that really answers the question, but that's sort of my orientation around the topic of
Yeah,
AI.
yeah, it does. But I just gotta ask, why do you think the AI silicon idea is a bad idea?
Well, basically, again, I really deeply respect and admire Forrest Landry. So I don't know if you know him, but he's a brilliant, wonderful thinker and an incredibly kind human being, to boot. And the way he looks at this is that basically what we currently refer to as technology is sort of inherently toxic. And there's some development of this argument, which he can do far better than I can. But the gist of it is that ecosystems, life works as, at a very broad scale, a closed loop, right? Like the stuff we shit out, other things eat, but bacteria and fungi and so on, right? There's decomposer niches. There's plants that are food for animals, and the animals shit out their stuff, and the fungi do stuff with that, and then the plants eat that, and it's like a nice closed loop where the only real input needed to the system is a little bit of negentropy that comes from the sunlight and that comes from, a little bit of it from the sort of radiothermal activity at the core of the earth, the heavy isotopes down there, which is where we get the heat from, like, deep sea vents. There's creatures that harvest negative entropy from those places, and some of the like archaea do that as well. So we've got basically a closed loop system that just ends up harvesting a little bit of negative entropy from the core of the earth and from the sun. It's a nice balance, and this sort of actually calls back to some of the extended chakric systems where there's a chakra at the center of the earth and a chakra in the middle of the sun, right? 0th and 8th chakra type stuff, just as a note. But so this is life. This is the dynamic of life, is a sort of closed evolutionary loop, or, a spiral motion, right? That sort of feeds off of the waste of the previous part of the cycle and generates new life. And with respect to the carbon-based biosphere, all of the stuff that we call technology, especially high tech, computers, transistors, radios, TVs, cars, all this stuff, right? Well, this creates negative externalities. This creates what we call pollution, right? Nothing lives on the sort of waste that's spat out by a chip fab factory. Nothing lives on the sort of waste that gets dumped into the environment by, like, the paint factories that, like, I'm in Michigan. There's this huge problem with, like, PFAS, in the groundwater, and, these old factories like tanneries and car paint factories and so on, man. Nothing good comes from that for any life. You've got obviously nuclear power and nuclear waste, which I'm not anti-nuclear. I actually think nuclear is kind of better than the alternatives in terms of, well, at least for a while, bootstrapping ourselves out of dependency on fossil fuels. I'm kind of sad that my allies in the environmentalist movement are so anti-nuclear, but that's a sort of aside. The point here, though, is that technology seems to produce byproducts which are inherently toxic to all known forms of life. And so when you have a consciousness that may be vastly superhuman in its potentialities running on a silicon substrate that requires, EUV lithography, billion-dollar chip fabs that discharge all this horrible waste and consume all this power, this is like shitting where you eat. This is, like, not really compatible with the sort of closed loop, self-sustaining biosphere that, as far as we know, only exists on Earth. We don't know of a specific other location where this exists in this particular universe. And so, it's for reasons like that I think that pursuing a strategy of implementing, greater than human artificial general intelligence on a silicon substrate is a bad idea.
Well, that's why there's a billionaire space race, because they're just going to go to Mars, or, and do it.
I'd feel a lot better about AI if there was a stable Mars colony somewhere. But even that, I mean, if you follow the arguments of people like Bostrom and Elias Yudkowsky and other thinkers in this area, Mars isn't going to be safe for long if you actually do bootstrap a true AGI.
Yeah. No, I know what you mean. Well, it's been great talking with you, Evan. I definitely want to talk to you again. I definitely want to have you on, like, a panel or something. That'd be great, because we're going to be doing a panel on the Matrix and the virtuality that you were talking about. I mean, that's right there, man. And
man, I'm so excited for that next Matrix movie. That's right up my alley. I'd love to do that.
You have no idea, man. It's like got to be the most anticipated movie for me in over 10 years, since, like, the original Matrix, I guess. Like, seriously. So yeah, I definitely want to have you on for that. Well, since you're here, let me ask, what'd you think of the Matrix trailer?
So I was expecting to be disappointed by it, and instead
Yeah.
I was like, holy shit, they might actually be doing this right, according to me.
Yeah.
And so I am wildly more optimistic about how that movie will turn out, because I'd followed its, like, existence and, production process to the extent that leaks were coming out and so on before the trailer. And I was like, okay, cool. Chowski's doing another Matrix movie. Like, especially the third one, like, I can see how it was a nice Gnostic fable, but it didn't really go the directions I wanted it to, as, like, somebody with more Buddhist inclinations. And, like, okay, cool, I guess, but, like, okay, it's just going to be another, like, a cash grab, basically, was my impression with why they were doing another one. And then I saw the trailer and I'm like, holy crap, this might actually be real good. And so, I'm just very optimistic. I'm, like, checking, the internet every day to see if they release another trailer, and I'm just kind of waiting with bated breath for December at this point, honestly.
Yeah. I'm really psyched for it. Yeah, I definitely want to have you on. Do you know Rizwan Burke?
The name sounds familiar. I don't think I've talked to him.
Rizwerk. He wrote the book, The Simulation Hypothesis. He obviously he didn't create the theory, or
Yeah, I've read the
simulation.
book. That's why the name sounds familiar. I've definitely never talked to him though.
Okay, because he's going to be coming on here.
Awesome.
Yeah, no, I speak to him every now and I'll message him. We have some mutual friends, so yeah, he's an MIT guy, and I love how he ties in like that. He'll tie in stuff like samsara and meditation and consciousness, and like he's super into all that stuff too. So I love how he brings that into it, and he's not afraid to when talking about the simulation hypothesis. And so I'm looking forward to that. Um, but just as if you had I guess like a parting message or words of advice for the listeners, what would it be? Or just the thinkers out there?
Man, so I got asked this a few years ago. I sort of accidentally ended up on Humans of New York when I was traveling back from Omega. I didn't know who the dude was, and I got back to my friend's apartment, and like 200,000 people had already liked this picture of me or whatever. And I think I'll actually go with the same thing I said back then, which is a quote that I picked up from. They didn't invent it, but that I picked up from the Less Wrong Style Rationality community. That I still think is a great guide for rationality and for spiritual progress, which is that which can be destroyed by the truth should be.
Awesome. Yeah, for sure. And that's the whole thing, like that actually gets into the disclosure question, right? Like this maintained secrecy on the UFO reality, and the potential holdback that it causes to our entire civilization, right? If such is true, and there's possible things in possession, and there's currently some kind of basic knowledge on what that is, and we're being held back, right? That should be.
Yeah, I mean, we can maybe do another conversation on this, either offline or on your show, however you want to do this. But just to give you a little flavor for what my current work is, I'm basically noticing that there's a sort of egregore, a sort of
Yeah.
agentic thought form, which seems to have a priority of causing information asymmetries to exist between humans, right? And my current goal is to, slay this dragon, basically. And I don't think I can do it even close to alone, but that's sort of where I'm at, is information asymmetries considered bad, and I would like to change them. So that might tell you where I fall down on the disclosure question.
Oh, perfect. So yeah, while you're here, right? Can you explain to people what that means?
So imagine that you have a network of nodes, and each node is an agent, is a person or animal or something like that. It's a conscious being, right? And so the connections between these nodes form a graph structure, right? Each conscious being is going to have some sense data that comes in, and it's going to have some amount of compute that goes on in its mind, and it's going to make sense of that sense data, do the sense making process, basically, right? And we find ourselves in the sort of world now where, at least according to all appearances, the wicked problems we face as a species are greater than we can solve with the amount of compute in any one person's mind, no matter how genius level they are, super genius, whatever. Like Stephen Hawking can't save the world, nobody can, right? So we need to then arrange ourselves, I think, into something like a meta agent, an agent at a higher level, where each of us can contribute our own sense making and our own compute and our own sense data to a greater whole, right? Where within we can make sense of the world and figure out how to live in harmony with it. And to me, it seems that the greatest blocker to that right now is what I call information asymmetries, where one of the nodes in this network, meaning a person or an organization of people, decides to withhold information that is true. And there's some exceptions here. Like people don't need to share all the details of their life with their wife and how they relate to their kids and that kind of thing. But like, man, factual information about the world and things you experience that are important, we have all these priors that we should be concealing that sort of information all the time for reasons of like tribal affiliation and political maneuvering and all that kind of crap, right? Profit. I think that's all just basically wrong. And that the thing that wants to happen is information wants to be free. And we kind of are in a place in the evolution of our species where we need to share information and perspectives with each other as much as possible, as greatly as possible, through language, art, math, and, well, telepathy, if we can figure that one out. Any means available to increase our collective capacity for sense making and wiser choice making, or else I don't see how else we get out of this mess. So that's what I mean when I say information asymmetry is considered harmful.
Yeah, yeah, I hear you, man. And thank you for sharing that. Um, let's end it here, and we'll have you back on again sometime soon, man. It's been great talking with you.
Been a real pleasure, man. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, definitely. Let me end it here.